Welcome to the Fearless Security webinar on Technical Security Architecture. Details Part 4, Structure and Content Protection. This is the outline of the presentation. We're going to talk about fear, uncertainty, and doubt versus facts, and how Fearless deals with structure and content, and then talk about how you can use the standard of practice to do this fearlessly, and circle back on the big picture. So an example of structural fear, uncertainty, and doubt is the claim that firewalls are dead. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we've heard this claim, for the last 10 years, say, in maybe longer in Gartner analysis. And yet, for some reason, the firewalls seem to still be here. Another one is, what about BYOD, bring your own device, and mobility? And doesn't that destroy firewalls? Aren't firewalls useless because of this? And the answer, of course, is no. Firewalls are still useful. In fact, without them, we'd probably be in lots of trouble. Content controls is another area where you get a lot of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. People start asking, well, are we talking about mass surveillance here? Are you trying to control what we think and communicate by controlling our content? And another one would be that content controls, lead to low surety solutions. And well, it turns out, of course, that many of the content controls are relatively low surety. On the other hand, without them, we might also have difficulties that we couldn't address. Basically, structural controls are almost all of the high surety methods available. They're also very widely used. It's easy to say you can't control content, but if you can't control content at all, you can't assure the utility of the content. So it really has to be part of any sensible protection program. How well you can control it is another issue. It has to do with the nature of the content and what you're trying to control about it. I think maybe what we need to do is take a step back and review these issues. So, I run a business, Fearless Security is a business. We use structural and content controls. So structural controls, we use a variety of zones, subzones, temporal microzones, other similar things. We use time limits on, what can go where and who can start what activities. We separate different sorts of data for different users and for different protection objectives. We limit the aggregation of risk by structurally separating things so that everything isn't physically in the same place or logically addressable in the same way. We also support logical separation with physical separation. So it's not just the logical separation. We physically put things in different places and put them on different networks, or in some cases, just don't connect them to networks or connect them only temporarily. From a standpoint of content, we limit the inputs to valid symbol sequences in state for things that have substantial consequences and involve remote access. We try to control useless and harmful content, although we're not perfect at it. We really work fairly hard to control content with business utility to assure that the content that we have that's useful remains useful. And we control content at rest, in use, and in transit. We try to use higher surety protective approaches when we can, basically because we don't want to have to be reactive and we don't want to suffer failures. So we think that proactive approaches work best for us, but that doesn't mean that that's true for everybody. So let's talk about how we can do this fearlessly. And Fearless takes the approach of standards of practice. And the standards of practice approach basically says, first of all, a standard of practice is not a standard. It's not something you follow. It's intended to be a set of reasonable and prudent practices. And when we say that, if you apply these practices, we believe you're being diligent as opposed to negligent. But we don't assert that the practices we have are the only such practices. And in fact, they're not always applicable. So when they're not applicable, you need to find something more suitable. Also, they're open source. They're reviewed internally, externally, and anybody that wants to can, and we encourage you to review and comment. To get there, you go to all.net, you click on protection. And from there, you go to the standards of practice, and I'm going to right-click to open it in a new tab so that I get the standards of practice. This is enterprise. And you can see that there are a wide variety of different issues here that we'll cover, and you just click on them and you find out the options, the decisions, and the basis. Each one of these things has an option, a decision, a basis. I'm going to find one that has a more clear decision here. This is a set of options that have to do with what attack mechanisms you consider. We'll look at another one, the risk aggregation. You can do ad hoc, analyze aggregates, and so forth. And the decision in this case is based on maturity level. If you're more mature, you're more able to do some of these things. And the basis, the descriptions, the definitions are all included. So we really appreciate any comments you have on these, especially to the extent that they're in your area of expertise. We use the standard of practice to help our experts ask a reasonably comprehensive set of questions. So we try not to forget things. It helps us not do that. To codify responses consistently in a defined language. It's sort of fundamental if you're going to have a scientific approach that you need to use a common language. So we try to define the language that we use and use the same words. We use it to guide decisions using the predefined bases, but they're not always applicable. So we identify variances from the baselines and we think about it and we work on it as a team. And so when the standard of practice works directly, we use it when it has a problem or when it's not thorough enough for the particular situation. We adapt and update it as and if appropriate. So we get a one-off situation that we're unlikely to encounter again. We'll just make judgments and have experts apply what they can in context. But if we see it more than once, then we look at updating the standard of practice to reflect it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how we do that as well. So we're talking here about structure, and the structural protection is among the highest surety if we do it well. It includes things like physical separation. By the way, physical separation, we've been hearing a lot of things that talk about getting past the air gap. The air gap is really not intended to block air. It's intended to block signaling, electromagnetic, sonic, any waveform. Changes in power consumption. Clearly, the optical output from displays, right? If you can look over my shoulder, although it's much more complicated, you can cause displays to flicker, and that flickering will go through glass and anything where light travels, even if it's not a direct line of sight, you might be able to get and send signals. The same with sound. Digital diodes, another example. This is something that may have a limited function back channel to say I received a file maybe once every hour to say things are going good. But the idea is to send information one direction. There are other sorts of flow controls. Virtual private networks is another sort of separation. It's structural. It's not as high surety. Dedicated lines or various approximations, mandatory and discretionary access controls, and so forth. Of course, doing them well implies a certain level of discipline. So what I want to do here is show you how this works in the standard of practice. And we're just going to start out with, let's see, I want to get to the ones that I'm talking about here too. So zoning is typically something that we hear a lot about. And there are different ways of structuring zoning and network. There's no zone separation. You just have maybe a perimeter, possibly with a DMZ. The internet's out here and everything the enterprise owns is sitting right behind that. They can all talk to each other. Another example is several different zones. So you separate it by business functions. So we have backups in one place, payables, receivables, and so forth. Another one is a project-based approach, where for each project you pop up a microzone or a zone and you keep it separate from everything else. And then there are these limited inside-out zoning structures and the cloud-based temporal microzones. These are methods that you use for accessing the internet via the internet, entering either a cloud service provider or entering your own infrastructure. And they're temporal microzones because they pop up with an encrypted channel and a capability at the endpoint during the period of use and then go away afterward. And then you get your fully layered architectures. These are they have a control zone, an audit zone, a DMZ, and where maybe you have some servers there, and then another perimeter in the trusted network, and another perimeter in the restricted network. And you get things like diodes, where you have a source and a destination, and information only flows one way. And any given organization will do this in a particular way. So, for example, there's an organization, this is one of ours, that supports a variety of different structures in different locations. We have that cloud sort of access. We have some business functions. We have a co-location facility that has a control zone but no audit zone. Um, Another fixed infrastructure that works a little bit differently, and so forth. So you get a lot of different structures, and the decision that we use has to do with selection of that structure, right? So if you require high surety flow limiting controls, use a POSET based with high separation, high surety separation. With different consequence levels, you might try different things. You use cloud-based zones, temporal microzones, for that particular situation, and so forth. So just different circumstances where different things are applied. And you can see there are lots of examples of structural things. Here's another one about firewalls. Just a question of what functions you have. We don't care what firewall you use, what the brand is. The issue is what are you using to do separation. In this particular case, that's the issue. So we're just trying to understand what you use, and there are different circumstances when you should be using different things according to the standard of practice. Of course, it may not apply to you. Physical separation is also part of it. So, for example, we use different wire colors for different zones so that we can tell immediately whether I'm in the red zone, the yellow zone, or the green zone. And the same thing with interfaces. You might use different interface types on different machines, physically separate things into different rooms or whatever the separation requirements are between the zones. Same with subzones. You might have additional markings and so forth. So there are lots of issues there. Another one is connection controls. How do you allow things to connect between different areas? So you can see we use, sort of sentences. You sort of put together the sentence and you get rid of the things that don't apply to you and add things that do apply to you. And there's a bunch of definitional areas. And then, on this basis, we deter this way, we prevent this way, we detect, react, and adapt this way. Right? So it creates a set of different issues. This is the particulars of what we're using in this particular infrastructure. We use the separation enforcement mechanisms for unauthorized or unmapped or inactive connections and identifiers. You can see the definitions up above that let you address that. Another example is microzoning. People haven't long thought about microzoning. Virtualization has been almost revolutionary in this area. So the notion of having microzones for fine granularity separation of clients, so each client might be in a microzone. They can also be used to limit the aggregation of risk. So it's not just a matter of separation. It also means, for example, if they are each separately encrypted, that if somebody manages to gain access to some subset of the keys, they don't have access to all the content. They may be temporal microzones, periods processing. You might use microzones for periods processing, so that during one period of time, one microzone is present and the other microzones can't be there simultaneously. You use that to limit various kinds of covert channels and so forth. So that's another example. I'm just going to go to one more for this particular one. This is zone-to-zone access. So, how do you communicate between and across zones? And again, depending on, in this case, on the consequence and the maturity of the organization, you do different things. In this case, if you're at less than the defined maturity level and it's a high consequence situation, we say don't allow communication to areas outside a zone or subzone. It's just too risky to do if you don't have that level of maturity at that high a consequence. So that gives you a sense of that one. I'm just going to pop down to, there are also structural elements that aren't necessarily that zoning approach. And I'm just going to give you some examples. The management metrics, deception, and so forth. So let's just, we'll go and look at them. Give you a sense. So there's the question of the security lead and where they're placed. And the decision basically here is based on size and the type and nature of the things you do. You should have a CISO or equivalent, security lead function at some level in the organization. So that's the organizational structure that's at issue here. Another example is metrics. How often should I collect what metrics, right? And so the decision down here, this is basically a standardized approach. You have different things continuously based on a shift, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, 6 months, yearly, randomly, event-driven hiring. And so we basically, say that, yearly and on events, for example, procedures in low consequence area should be reviewed. That is, you should do measurement, measure, whether and to what extent they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Another example here, something fairly different, is in incident handling. When do you use deception? A lot of organizations sort of opt out of the deception approach. We think there are various situations when you should be using deceptions, and I think deceptions are becoming more common and more popular, if you will. And we certainly use them at firewalls. We don't want people to be able to do a scan of our network and determine what's there and what they can access and what not. We'd rather have they scan the firewall, find lots and lots and lots of stuff there. And as they find all that stuff, be aware that they're trying to break in. They're trying to find out, do intelligence against it. And so we use counterintelligence in that part of the space. And there are other places. Another interesting example is looking at counterintelligence. How do you counter the attempts for people to gather intelligence on you? And so, counterintelligence has been known for a long time. Got a lot of aspects to it. I don't want to go into too much details. Here's something most people don't address: human factors. We think human factors are very important. And although we only have a limited number of things we have enough information on to make reasonably better decisions than just making a guess. One of the areas is user decision making. The question is, you have users making decisions, and a lot of places, the user looks and thinks about, isn't really sure how to make that decision. Well, there's a timeliness requirement on some decisions. And then you get the even worse situation where the user interface pops up a box and says, "Oh, bad thing has happened." Then there's an OK button. Well, thanks for telling me something bad has happened. Now I have to click OK and say it's OK that something bad happened. That's ridiculous. So in any case, the point here is there are a wide variety of protective approaches that apply. Oops, I got the wrong direction there. Then we have content controls, and that's the second part of today's discussion is content controls. Behavior, by the way, is also cross-cutting and infused throughout the standard of practice. It's a complex issue. The technical aspects of information protection very often ignore the behavioral aspects, but there's been a lot of recent studies that show, for example, that when you increase the amount of workload in protection, it doesn't get done as well. People are just not willing to go beyond some certain point in terms of doing what you want them to do. So they tend to become maliciously compliant or non-compliant, and they start to work against you. An example is password controls, and I tend to harp on this. I've written a number of articles on it. You get lots of complaints about passwords from all sides. They're too easy to guess, so you got to make them harder and longer. Then they get too long to use or impossible for real people to remember. And the next one is they're too easy to steal, so don't write them down. But how can I remember a 40-byte random string generated by somebody? Even if I get picked from the first 100,000 of them, I'm unlikely to find one I'm going to be able to remember without writing it down. So if somebody takes a password, they get access over time, so that the response is very often to change them more often. But am I really going to memorize a 40-byte random string every month, every week, every day? And how often do I use the system? If I use the system once every month and I have to change it every 2 weeks, I'm doubling my effort, mostly just to change passwords to usually little or no effect. A big problem is reuse, of course, of passwords. Break into one system and you get the other, so of course the response is don't reuse them. Well, if I have to memorize every one and I have access to hundreds of sites, it's just not going to function. So, there are other approaches, right? And for alternatives, I just want you to point to an article here. If you go to all.net and look at two-factor this into your thinking. It's the name of the article, and you can search for it on Google or just go to all.net and find it. And that talks about the two-factor authentication issues and challenges and what's better and worse in what circumstance. And it's a non-trivial issue. It's not just something which you can readily do and have it work everywhere. You can slow the guessing process by not letting them steal password files. So one of the things about the assumptions about passwords that they're easy to guess and so forth is that the guessing is assumed to be with a copy of the encrypted password file. But guess what? If they've gotten to the encrypted password file, they've probably gotten more than user access to the system. So they don't really need to guess passwords at that point. They can use that access to take advantage of it. Another one is to support passwords with password managers, which are widely available and keep track of all this stuff so you're not limited by human cognition. Here are some examples of content controls from the standard of practice. I'm just going to go back to I'll close this guy up. I don't use that anymore. Go back to the standard of practice and just look at some of these. And we'll pop up the location. Sort of fundamental that work and content are not always co-located. So in different circumstances, depending on whether there's habitability issues. So if you have some computer system in the middle of a chemical plant where it's extremely hazardous and people can't go without special suits on, you probably don't want people there all the time. So if it's not habitable, it's different than in habitable areas. And for different risk levels, there are different ways of configuring basically content secured or not, workers secured or not, infrastructure secured physically, logically, or not secured. And so there are different circumstances under which different ones apply. So that's an example of one of these. Another one is go down here to number risk management. This is a separation of duties issue. Basically, we need to consider whether an individual is allowed to specify what's to be done, carry it out, and then verify that it was done. So normally, separation of duties would say you can't do all three. In fact, usually you want specify and verify to be separated from perform or manage. And that's especially if you're trying to effect protection and you don't have much choice. If you don't do that, if you don't have separation of duties, then one person can do whatever the worst case harm is for that portion of the environment. Another example is procedures, right? So procedures cover which activities, by which different things are happened. They're defined and implemented in writing or through a workflow system or checklist or what have you, and carried out by, whatever mechanism they're carried out by. And of course, there are different circumstances, in this case, driven by consequence of maturity, where different things would happen. We basically say with low maturity and high consequence, you shouldn't operate in that situation. You just, that's not going to work out for you. We'll go and look at another one here, different example, security awareness programs. People have different awareness programs. Certainly it's a good idea to maintain an appropriate level of awareness so people know how to behave in different particular circumstances. And so, and then we'll go to, here's another one, malicious alteration detection. This is something that very often it's taken the very narrow form of antivirus or something, or anti-Trojan, but there's all sorts of ways that you could maliciously alter content. And if you can't detect it, then you're going to get wrong answers. So there are different approaches, and again, based on consequence, we think there are different things that you might reasonably do to control that. So I'm just going to put out of here, and so circling back, the controls that touch the content in the big picture of things, these controls here that actually touch the content, are the things that at the end of the day assure the utility of the content, which is to say it's really all about the business. And that's where we started this series of talks, talking about the business. Right? It's all about how the protection program helps the business work and keeps it working properly and keeps it from failing in harmful ways. The standard of practice is intended to address it, but sometimes, we get into the trees and can't see the forest. This big picture is what it's all about. How does the business work, oversight, which sort of determines the duty to protect, and turn the duty to protect through risk management into what to protect, how well. There's a management process that has to control. It's a sort of a control system that controls the various aspects of what's required for protection. There's this control architecture area, which is something most people don't really take into account. These are concepts, and the concepts drive how you implement the technical security architecture, which deals with life cycles and content, inventory and workflows, protective mechanisms, and processes and data and state controls. So just, we don't want to forget the big picture. So what's the even bigger picture? This is what we're going to be discussing in next month's webinar. We're going to start discussing the standards of practice in the larger context. That is, how we're applying and adapting the standards of practice and how you can apply and adapt them as well.